Back in 2018, I watched this particular interview with director Jordan Vogt-Roberts about his vision for the potential Metal Gear Solid film adaptation, which he was or still is supposed to direct. And one of the things he said in that interview really stuck with me. And I think this is a really intelligent and perceptive view of how and why video game films haven't really worked and what makes for a great video game film.
The video games transitioning into movies has been a problem. And it has not, there hasn't been that, maybe there, do you think there's been a home run yet?
Well, the three examples that I always give that I think are home runs are actually not based on video games, but I think they're video game movies. And that's, I think Kubo is basically a video game movie. It follows the mechanics of Zelda and quests and armor upgrades and bosses much in the same way a Zelda game does. Snowpiercer, I think, fundamentally taps into the mechanics of a left-to-right side-scroller. Everything is going left to right the entire movie. Every train car represents a new level, a new stage. And then Edge of Tomorrow, I think, taps into the sort of meta mechanics of video games, the way that you respawn, the way you go back to a checkpoint. And so I think there have been three seminal films that in a more meta way tap into sort of what you feel when you play a game. They just don't happen to be based on video games.
His three favorite video game films, as he describes them of recent memory, are all not based off any actual games, but I love the way that he looks at it from a story and a structural point of view. And ever since I watched that interview, I've seen quite a few non-video game adaptations kind of have that interesting video game style structure. I think Mission Impossible Fallout kind of has it, Aquaman kind of has it, and I'd even go as far as saying Rocketman kind of has it. But today, I wanted to talk about a film which I think perfectly fits this kind of style, this kind of structure that we don't often get with conventionally done films, and that is of course 1917. Let us talk first about some of the big differences between the narrative structure of, mainstream video games in comparison to films. Please do feel free to add any suggestions of similarities and differences. These are just some of my observed opinions. First of all, video games are obviously much longer, which I think does have a massive effect on video game adaptations not translating as well as a book or a comic when you're forced to fit 20 hours worth of information and character development into a 2-hour film. It can feel forced and unnatural. Secondly, it's interactive. The big aspect of video games that films don't have is that you are in control of the character, and in some cases you have the power to dictate how the story moves forward. So with a film, you're just the audience, but here, you're literally part of that world, if not the center of the world. And also in some cases, you're kind of the writer and director as well. This is something that traditional films can pretty much never achieve because it's just not how things work, it's not how things are done, and it's why these two mediums are different. Up next is perspective. Films can be told from both a subjective and objective point of view. We often hear people talk about how a film has a fly-on-the-wall quality to it, which basically means when you watch it, you feel like you are a passive observer, watching these events unfold from a distance. But sometimes you can also feel like you're in that character's headspace, so much so to the point where you're unsure of what's actually true and what isn't. I think that video games cannot really be as objective, for the simple fact that you are that character, and you see that world from their point of view, and their point of view alone. In third-person video games, you are literally behind them the whole time, and in first-person games, you are them. Unless there are multiple characters, of course, but then that kind of makes it even more subjective, if anything. Even if we're to bring up games like The Sims, or Warcraft, or Age of Empires, or FIFA, where you are literally looking down at the character from this god's eye view, and you control everything, you are still controlling everything. So it's still very much subjective. We also have to touch on the visual presentation of video games in comparison to films. If you take out the cutscenes, video games are basically a set of long takes happening in real time, and you control it. And with God of War, it's actually all in one take. This idea of everything happening in real time is one of the reasons long take driven films with a clear end goal, like say Children of Men, can be seen as very similar in style to a video game. Finally, on the idea of story, most video games have a very clear end goal. They establish early on that the goal is to kill this one person, or to get this particular treasure, or to stop this particular villain. Another really good example of a film structured like a video game is Kill Bill. Even in the name, you know exactly what needs to happen. She needs to kill Bill. Bill is the final boss, and you'll win the game or complete the film when Bill is dead. And just like every good video game, there are a number of obstacles. She has to take out all the mini-bosses along the way. And she also gets quite a few literal upgrades, from vehicles to weapons. Just like Jedi Fallen Order, we get a flashback training montage that allows her to unlock a hidden skill. So films obviously do have this kind of quality, but there's also films that are more character-centric or more concerned with the world, right? To the point where there is no quest. And when there's no actual quest for a video game, then it's not really that compelling. Even open world games have primary missions and then side missions. But of course, after this really long setup, we're here to talk about 1917. Let us look at why this film, in my opinion, is one of the closest to fitting into all of these aforementioned categories. First things first, it's just under 2 hours, so it's not as long as most video games. Well, I mean, Journey's not that long, right? But yeah, that's really the hardest box to check, isn't it? 1917 is also a film, which means it is not interactive. You cannot control the character, you can't do anything but experience the film. I mean, I was very invested and wish I could control certain things so that the turnout would be a little bit more positive, right? 1917, the film, has Blake getting stabbed, but hopefully 1917, the video game, would then allow you to disarm and subdue the enemy before he kills your friend. But to be fair on films, which is still my favorite medium, after all this is a film channel, the fact that you can't control things does make certain moments feel far more impactful and allows the creators to tell their story. And I think that there is this beauty to inevitable storytelling that you might not get as much in video games. Alright, perspective. I think that more so than most films, the way 1917 goes about portraying the perspective of the story is deeply linked to its cinematography and visual language. So I'm going to combine those two topics. 1917 has got to be one of the most subjectively told films of recent memory. I mean, you spend the entire film with these characters, especially Schofield, from the opening to the closing shot. You're with them, and you're seeing things from their point of view the entire time. Sometimes the camera work in these tracking shots actually looks like a third-person video game. I mean, come on, you can't look at this shot and not think it feels like something out of Uncharted. This actually looks like a QuickTime event where you would rapidly press R1 to dodge the plane or something. Or just imagine holding down R2 as you sprint your way through this map. But if you shoot a running scene like this, it doesn't have the same effect. I'm not saying this one is better than the other, but one feels more like a game than the other. Aside from Martin Scorsese, obviously, I've heard quite a few people describe certain films as, reminiscent of theme park rides in their design. And 1917 to me feels like a video game in its design. Sam Mendes and Roger Deakins have talked before about how they didn't just want it to be a long tracking shot from behind a character's back, and wanted a bit of visual diversity, which we'll get to, but also I think diversity in terms of perspective. It's not just purely from the point of view of Schofield. There are moments that let the film and the audience breathe a little and take in the world around them as opposed to just being in it with that character. I think the two biggest moments of objectivity in the film are this scene and this scene, where you leave the protagonist for a second and absorb the world and the atmosphere around him. It stops becoming about that particular person, and I think it was a very intentional decision, as those two moments, in my opinion, are the most dreamlike and surreal and traditionally cinematic moments in the film, because let us remember that these kinds of long takes and steady cam style tracking shots weren't ridiculously popular to a lot of directors, especially a lot of the old masters, who believed that editing and the ability to cut was one of the defining traits of this art form.
What one might call pure cinematics, the assembly of film, and how it can be changed to create a different idea. Now we have a close-up. Let me show what he sees. Let's assume he saw a woman holding a baby in her arms. Now we cut back to his reaction to what he sees, and he smiles. Now what is he as a character? He's a kindly man. He's sympathetic. Now, let's take the middle piece of film away, the woman with the child, but leave his two pieces of film as they were. Now we'll put in a piece of film of a girl in a bikini. He looks, girl in a bikini, he smiles. What is he now? The dirty old man. He's no longer the benign gentleman who loves babies. That's the difference. That's what film can do for you.
And again, aside from cutscenes, video games don't really give you the ability to just cut. Once you're in a level, you kind of have to do it. Same thing with 1917. The real-time nature of the filmmaking is what makes it so intense. And it has this really nice balance of let's break some rules and try a less conventional approach to telling this story, but also we want to maintain the cinematic nature of it and not get too lost in the gimmick, and that never happens. And I don't think the long take aspect of the film ever trumps the story or the characters, but it complements it. After a while, you just stop noticing, in the same way that the controls in a game can start to become second nature after a while. What's great about this is that they've established such a specific filmmaking language that they can also break their own filmmaking and cinematography rules to really emphasize a certain moment, and of course they do that. Filmmaking aside, the script of 1917 is one of the most important reasons I think it functions like a video game narrative. Two things are established almost instantly: that these characters aren't really that important in the grand scheme of World War I. They're not generals or prime ministers. Essentially, they're shown as interchangeable foot soldiers who just so happen to be set this mission because one of them is brothers with another person. They don't come with heaps of backstory, and so just like an avatar in some video games, you can kind of project yourself onto these guys. And so in that way, you feel a bit more invested because of the everyman nature of these characters. One day that could be you. The more important thing though, is that the actual mission is told in like the second scene. Get these orders to Colonel Mackenzie or die trying. If you die, more people will die because of your failure. Instantly setting up the stakes and the ultimate end goal. Just like how Bill needs to be killed, or the ashes need to be scattered. And just like every good video game, there are a number of obstacles that allow the character to grow. Most of the characterization happens in the moment, through their actions, and a bit of exposition about who they are as they're walking, because they need to maintain forward momentum. Just like a video game, you have some dialogue, then a sequence, then some dialogue, then a sequence, then some more dialogue, then sequence. Not to mention the checkpoint mini-bosses, so to speak. 1917 just so happens to have Colin Firth, Andrew Scott, Mark Strong, Benedict Cumberbatch, and Richard Madden as these checkpoints. So there you have it, guys, some of the differences and similarities between video games and films, and how they can be influenced by one another for great effect. Not that often do I get a chance to talk about games on this channel, even though I really enjoy them, but I certainly hope that anyone who watches this video will be inspired by Vogt Roberts' philosophy that effective video game films are more about the execution and how the story is told, regardless of what kind of story you choose to adapt. That it is more important to look at whether it actually feels like you're getting a video game style experience in a film, even if the property isn't actually based on video games. With the video game adaptation genre being so notorious amongst filmmakers and fans alike, and I certainly hope to see more adaptations that emulate 1917's approach, even if Sam Mendes had no intention to make it feel like one. And should I ever get the chance to direct a video game adaptation, I will definitely be heeding Jordan Vogt Roberts' ideas and philosophies.